Welcome to this ECFR webinar. We're going to discuss yesterday's State of the Union address by the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. We know yesterday was a very eventful day. It started with 19 drones entering Polish airspace, a certain reaction from some of the NATO allies, but basically a big incursion in Europe's security. It was also the first day of the French blockade under a new prime minister. And against this background, von der Leyen was really trying to make the point of the longer term vision for the EU. So we will try to focus on this particular event, understanding that the rest is also in the background. I have to announce that this event is recorded and that all of the participants can ask the questions in the Q&A box. Please feel free to do that even while my colleagues are speaking. And now is the moment to introduce them. You know all of them actually, but still, we have with us Janka Oertel, who is our distinguished policy fellow working on many issues, but mostly now on green tech. We have Tiago Antunes, who is our associate policy fellow working mainly on security and resilience. And we have Agathe Demarais, who is the head of our Geoeconomics and tech work here at ECFR. My name is Vessela Tcherneva, and I am ECFR's deputy director. So maybe we can start with the question of how do you evaluate this speech? And because security was what the speech started by, von der Leyen said the EU is in a fight. She evaded the word war, but that was clearly kind of the message that there is that the EU is being confronted on many fronts, but most of all in security. So Tiago, I will start with you. To what extent has the EU really delivered, looking back in this past year, on readiness, on preparedness? We heard last time around about the defense union. How far are we on that agenda?
Thank you, Vessela. So the speech focused a lot on security, and the President of the Commission started with by painting a very stark picture of the situation that the EU is facing. And you actually mentioned the context in which she delivered her speech, so it's quite telling that on that very same morning, there was this invasion by Russian drones into Polish and therefore into European airspace. So this is unfortunately a good illustration of the challenges and the threats that the EU is facing from a security perspective. So there is a lot to do. So I would say two things. First, our starting point at the EU in terms of security is very limited. So there's lots of ground to cover in order to become what we and President von der Leyen said yesterday, that we want to become this strong global power. Also in terms of military and defense, we have to assert our position in the global order, which is less and less rules-based and more power-based. And we are squeezed among these very hostile or ambivalent foreign powers, as she said. So we need to take more responsibility for our defense. So the diagnosis is correct. She did not mince her words. She painted a very stark picture of the situation by saying we are in a fight. I think she did well by being very clear, very blunt in her assessment. So the challenge is big. Over the past year, quite a few things have happened, indeed. So we have done, the EU has come up with first this plan that was called Rearm Europe, then rebranded into Resilience 2030. It's a package that can go up to 800 billion, but really the most realistic part of it is the SAFE program, which is a loan of 150 billion euros that member states can resort to in order to spend more on defense. And indeed, 19 member states have already pledged to use this money to step up their expenditure on defense. So the EU is really making real on their pledges, particularly in the NATO summit, to spend more on defense. It's unclear whether we will reach the milestones of 3.5 plus 1.5, but regardless of that, member states are indeed taking more money, taking these loans to spend more. Also, the Commission proposed this simplification omnibus also on defense. So in order to streamline procedures, so things are happening on the Ukraine front, on support to Ukraine as well. Ursula von der Leyen yesterday told us of this figure, almost 170 billion euros in support for Ukraine. Of which 60 billion in military, directly in military support. So this is very important because Ukraine is our very first line of defense. Also on sanctions to pressure Russia, we already have 18 packages. We are on the brink of a 19th package, but we need other partners to get involved as well. So things are happening, but be mindful that our starting point was very limited. So we still need to cover a lot of ground and make up for lost time.
I mean, listening to you, it all seems actually quite okay, quite unproblematic. Yet, looking at Ukraine, at the diminished US support, at the growing Russian attacks, at the growing suffering of Ukrainians, the picture doesn't look great. So where has the EU fallen short in its support for Ukraine?
Well, several things. The Ukraine needs more money to be able to back its war effort and sustain its war effort. So we need to be able to find financing streams and mechanisms to support, because Ukraine has did a lot on itself in strengthening its defense industry base on manufacturing drones, but we need to support Ukraine against this huge blockage of intensifying attacks from Russia. We'll talk about her speech later, I believe, and she proposed a few ways in which to increase support to Ukraine. But we need to put more pressure on Putin as well. But that needs to happen with other partners. So we need to work beyond the EU. Then we also need to go, because there's the military front, and then there's the more broader security consideration and preparedness, and we need to work a lot more in order to ensure preparedness. This implies or requires a whole of society approach. It implies moving into a war economy, really, or almost a war economy. And so we need to spend more in terms of defense and buy more military equipment and have more military capabilities. We'll always be limited in comparison. There's strategic enablers in which we will always be dependent on the US. So it will take some time, but we need to have this whole economy focused on this objective of ensuring an increased resilience of Europe against hybrid threats, against traditional threats, against in a very much more hostile and aggressive and confrontational environment that we're living in.
Thank you. Speaking of the economy, maybe I'll turn to Janka and the whole green tech business, because this has been not only one of the main points of von der Leyen's speech yesterday, but also one of the big advantages of Europe in the past years, which it started gradually losing. What has happened looking back at the past year, in your view?
So first of all, maybe I think she deserves a bit of a shout out for this speech because it was quite feisty. It was pretty no nonsense and it was very honest. And actually, that's not something that can be taken for granted these days. And I think particularly on two areas that I look most at, that's China and the clean tech space, that was a very no-nonsense approach. What she was basically telling all of her very conservative colleagues in the European Parliament is that the end of the combustion engine or extending that would not be sort of the solution to all our competitiveness problems. The idea that by just delaying some kind of climate goals, we would all be automatically competitive again, she basically put a really clear line under that and said the future for European prosperity lies in digitalization and clean tech, period. And she said, we have to take control over technologies and energies that will fuel our economies. And taking control is actually quite a stark wording for this, right? This is not something where she says we should also be competitive in this. No, we should be able to take control in these areas. So that means throwing down the gauntlet as well for China that is dominating these industries and saying we will protect our markets, we will protect our industries, and we will make sure that we will go forward with the initiatives that we have started over the last year, from the Net Zero Industry Act to the Clean Industrial Deal to the battery booster, her conversation she's having tomorrow for the auto sector where things are going to move on electric vehicles. So she has put basically all of her political weight behind that agenda. And quite frankly, even 48 hours before the State of the Union, that wasn't necessarily to be expected, right? A lot of people would have expected some wobbling and some wavering and some whether this is going to be all that green, that agenda. What she basically did is she really connected the question of how can Europe be prosperous and strong in the future and have greater autonomy and be able to make its choices with the agenda of like clean tech competitiveness. And I thought that was sort of something that I would have wanted her to say, because I truly believe that she has a fair point there, and it's kind of very much in line with the Draghi report and very much in line with where sort of the economists are going on this. But it's really not uncontroversial among the parliamentarians that she was speaking in front of, that where a large portion of them would like to see a massive rollback of all of this. So I think that in that sense, the speech itself and sort of kind of taking stock a little bit of what has been done of her agenda that she's trying to push forward, and that is at the moment receiving a lot of pushback from member states and even the parliament, is something that she was trying to reinforce here. And I think will do so in the future as well.
Can you unpack a little bit this push for a rollback of the green agenda, as because it has a lot to do with European politics these days, and I think the past year was we saw actually this moving also into the mainstream.
Yeah, and it's an interesting constellation when you hear people like Manfred Weber from her own party, speaking about the need for greater European sovereignty with the experience of the humiliating trade negotiations with the United States, going through all of this experience that Europe needs to be stronger. And then when asked in an interview with a German newspaper what the solution to it is, he says the 2035 end of the combustion engine is the solution. Like, we need to get technology openness here, that is the only answer that can be found in some of these areas. That's obviously not good enough. And she was not taking that bait. And I thought that that was actually quite interesting, that she was saying, look, we have to talk about deadlines. And I'm sure the 2035 deadline will see some watering down as well. And she seemed willing to go there and willing to go to the sort of, there will be flexibility and we will find solutions. But the general course of action is something that she has kind of cemented now and put forward as, this is what I stand for. And I believe in it, not because this is all about climate change, but because this is about the future of our prosperity, our industrial base, and our economy. So I think that's quite interesting.
Thank you. You mentioned the Draghi report, and this was the big hook of her last year's speech. Competitiveness, Europe's ability to catch up on technology, and so on. And I want to turn to Agathe now and ask her, looking back, many observers are critical and they say nothing has happened. I mean, the Draghi report was great, but what has happened? And this time, von der Leyen was actually quite assertive on the whole competitiveness issue, quite concrete. That paired with the American tariffs, how does it make it look? I mean, has there been much of a progress really on the competitiveness and economy portfolio?
Well, I think that what was striking, and I completely share Janka's assessment, is that the speech that we heard yesterday ticked all the boxes in terms of the diagnosis, you know, in terms of geoeconomics and tech. Von der Leyen started with Ukraine in terms of sanctions, as Tiago mentioned. It was really a bold call for united resolve in terms of Europeans continuing to impose sanctions on Russia. Von der Leyen mentioned the shadow fleet, curbing Russia's energy revenues. She ticked the boxes in this field. In the trade field, she also mentioned a number of things that economists are calling for. She mentioned deepening trade ties with other economies, new partners, which is certainly a way to help EU exporters that will be affected by US tariffs. She also mentioned deepening the single market. Well, she mentioned all the right things. And in investment also, there was this push from von der Leyen to mention cutting red tape, adopting an EU 28th regulatory regime for startups, which would really help startups to adopt an EU-wide regulatory regime, but also measures to boost, well, clean tech, digital technology, this twin transition. I mean, it was all the right diagnosis. It was all the right boxes, definitely, in the speech. I think if we want to be picky, there would be two things that I would have loved to hear about in the speech. The first one was in the economic field, collaboration with G7 allies, which I think is going to be critical under Trump, especially. So, of course, the US difficult, but there are still other members in the G7 and the G20. I was looking yesterday, and I don't think there was a single mention of the G7 or the G20 in the speech. And the other part in the speech where maybe von der Leyen could have said more, but still it was already a long Christmas wish list of all the right things, I would say is also about the impact of some of Trump's policies in the geoeconomics field on Europe in investment, because the US is planning, maybe, as per the America First investment policy, to ask all investors around the world, including European investors, to make a choice between the US and China for their investments. This could have tremendous consequences on European investments, and also finance, because we could have currency wars about the fate of the US dollar. So these are the two things that maybe von der Leyen could have alluded to. But actually, to answer your question, I think that the diagnosis is completely correct. We had all the proposals from Draghi. We had this speech from von der Leyen. But the question to me is twofold. The first question is about implementation, because you can have the best diagnosis. If you don't have implementation, well, you're in trouble. And what we see is that less than 10% of the recommendations from the Draghi report have been implemented so far. So this implementation question is going to be key. If it takes 1 year to implement 10%, are we going to have to wait for 10 years before the full report is implemented? And we're talking about a report that is garnering a broad consensus, at least from the economist side of things. And there is also, when we talk about sanctions against Russia, there is an elephant in the room. It is collaboration with the US in this field, because of course we see a lot of, well, back and forth in terms of the US position regarding Russia. So that's the first question to me, the implementation. And the second question is, would that all be enough, even if all of this were to be implemented, all these great reforms in the geoeconomics and tech field were to be implemented, would that be enough? Because what the EU is fighting for at the moment is global economic relevance. We see that the US and China are racing ahead. We see that the EU is gradually losing global economic relevance, and thus global relevance, because economics is really a determinant of geopolitical power. Von der Leyen alluded to the fact that it's the end of the rules-based order. This is going to have tremendous consequences for Europe in the economic field, because Europe has long seen itself as the guardian of the rules-based order. So do we need a complete paradigm shift? How can Europe best respond to all the shifts that we are seeing? To me, these are the main questions that we still need to answer as Europeans.
And do you think that von der Leyen's response to the critiques around the EU-US agreement on trade was sufficient?
Well, I completely agree with the EU's take on this one. Tariffs are taxes, and European firms, American firms and consumers are going to be the ones paying for these taxes. We see all the econometric modeling. The US tariffs are going to be taxes for US firms and households, and they are going to be paying for them. And what we see as economists in the data is that no retaliation from the EU is actually yielding the best outcome from the economic perspective. And actually, von der Leyen said exactly this. Tariffs are taxes. These are going to be paid by Americans. So of course, there's the political dimension. It's another dimension here. But if we focus from a pragmatic approach, an economic approach, not retaliating with tariffs for the EU is the best course of action. And von der Leyen also mentioned that it's also about predictability for European firms. European firms very much prefer to know that they will be facing a 15% tariff on their exports to the US than being stuck in long negotiations and predictable negotiations. I think that this uncertainty question is really key. So as an economist, I completely agree with this take from von der Leyen. I actually have a policy brief coming next week with ECFR, outlining this potential response from the EU and how the EU can make the best of the Trump geoeconomic storm.
I will add here there is a question in the Q&A box about the Trump request for the EU to go with 100% tariffs on China and India. What would you say to that?
Well, I think this is completely unrealistic. So this is the Trump administration essentially saying they won't be moving forward with sanctions on Russia because they know that the EU is not going to be imposing such tariffs. So it's I don't know if it's smart, but it's a way to say, making an impossible demand from a partner in the hope that the partner will say no, and then the US will be able to say, oh, okay, then we can't really tighten the grip in terms of sanctions on Russia.
May I disagree
Janka,
slightly here,
yes.
if I'm allowed to, because I think it's not actually a play. I think Trump is also a bit angry with where things are going. He didn't like the parade. He's changing his approach to China at the moment again. So I think the EU at least has to intellectually get ready for two scenarios. They have to get ready for a scenario in which, this is all just a play and he makes this request for China and India to be like tariffed, and he doesn't go for sanctions but for tariffs and knows that that's not possible. But I think we also have to intellectually go into the zone of what if he says, okay, don't tariff, just sanction, make it the equivalent, and we'll do just China, not India. How ready and willing are you to really cut funding streams to Russia at the moment? This would be a major problem in capitals, because that's actually something the EU could do. Arguably, it's something the EU should have done already for a really long time. And it would be a really problematic play to come back from the EU side to say that's not actually an impossible demand, that's a quite possible demand. So I think we would be well advised here in Europe to think about what a potential version of that could look like, how we would respond to a request of that sort, and what would be feasible with member states around this issue. I think that is why negotiations at the moment are going on. And I think we had an allusion to that in the State of the Union address, where she said we will go after third countries as well. So I do think there is some serious thinking going on to not take Trump just seriously, but also literally in that regard. So I would be a bit more cautious here in just putting it off as, this is just a Trump play. I think there is a good reason to take it a bit more seriously.
What do you think we should sanction in particular?
I mean, this is where Agathe comes in. She's the sanctions expert, but obviously financial institutions that enable transaction, companies that are shipping to Russia. You can have the oil companies, of course, but you can also go into the semiconductor industry. You can go into the drone industry. Everything that has flown over the Polish border is basically of Chinese origin. So I think we need to be really clear about here, what is the real security challenge that we're facing, and how does that weigh against our economic interests? And I think, as often with some of the Trump requests, he puts a finger in a wound where there is a kernel of truth to it, and the question of how important is it really to us to get something done on these matters. And so I think that's where some thinking on the European side needs to start happening, and is happening, on how this could be reflected.
So we go back to security, and maybe I can turn again to Tiago with the question on how do you think this whole readiness 2030 concept should be implemented, and whether there was a question also from one of our participants about Eurobonds, whether we should be funding some of that with Eurobonds, and this whole, I think, area of defense spending and defense financing, How do you see it going forward? Obviously, we're entering also the MFF negotiations, so there will have to be some answers to that pretty soon.
We'll be discussing money a lot. So money is always the tricky issue, and for security and defense purposes, definitely we need a lot of money. Also for investment on green, on tech, on digital, etc. But for defense and security, we'll need a lot of money, and we'll need original ideas. So the president of the commission yesterday came up with a few that might or might not work. We are still missing on details regarding financial support to Ukraine. She mentioned the reparations loan based on the immobilized assets from Russia, but without touching the assets themselves. This would be leveraged on the future reparations that we expect Russia to pay to Ukraine. This is it might be an interesting avenue to proceed. To pursue. She also mentioned a front loading of 6 billion from the G7 loan to support an alliance of drone manufacturing alliance with Ukraine. This also makes sense. So as Agathe was saying, also on the security front, she ticked a lot of boxes. She said the right things. Now the key is delivery and implementation. And because we now have, she also mentioned another roadmap that she'll present at the next European Council on joint projects for defense and goals for 2030. I will say that we already have roadmaps and strategic compasses and action plans. We don't need more strategic documents. We have documents that tell us what course we should take. We need to focus everything on implementation. We need speed, we need agility, because we need to make up for lost time, as I mentioned, on the security front. And we need to see things happening. She also mentioned an European semester on defense. This also might be interesting, but if it's just another procedure, a routine procedure that adds to other formalities, then it is no good. So a lot of it depends on how it will be put on the ground. Then just another mention to something that Ursula von der Leyen yesterday talked about, which is the Eastern Flank Watch. So protecting and reinforcing the surveillance on the eastern border of the European Union. This also makes a lot of sense, of course. The border countries are more vulnerable, and the EU should step up its support. She mentioned an idea which is very appealing, of a drone wall. I don't know if this is realistic, to be honest, if this is feasible, but it does sound reassuring. So I hope it is possible to build a drone wall. I don't know. So many of the things she mentioned make sense. And are things that the EU should do. But now we need to see things happen on the ground. In no more than strategic documents or action plans or procedures. We need action from the EU and from the member states, because a lot hangs also on the member states. And for instance, now if we mention Gaza, for instance, where she was also quite bold and took some further steps that the European Commission had not taken yet, but probably many of the things she mentioned are not feasible, in the sense that it will not be possible to find an agreement from the 27 to move forward on some of those things. So she also left a call for unity within the European Union, because we are in a fight. We should not be fighting each other. We should be united to face our external threats. So we need to find unity, and a lot, to be honest, the Commission is coming with the right initiatives, but a lot then depends on the follow-up that the member states give to those initiatives.
Thank you. We have already started taking questions in, so I will continue if my colleagues don't mind, and I will try to take 2 raised hands. Let me see if technology will allow us to do that. Sophia Angelis first. Let me see. Does it work? Can you come in? you should be able to talk. Can you come in? No, we can't hear you. Can I ask you to type your question in the Q&A box? I apologize, but this is the format of this webinar. I suppose that bars us from the possibility of having direct interventions. Sorry about that. There was one question to Janka and Agathe on China, whether you were surprised that there was so little direct focus on China. Maybe we can ask Janka first.
So I was not actually surprised that it was a little less focused on China. I thought she had a lot of ground to cover in those 45 minutes. And you know, you remember that really hard pivot she did between Gaza and competitiveness, you know, which already elicited quite some like arousal in the parliament at the time. So it was hard for her, I think, even to get from the topics from Ukraine, from Gaza, from the things that really at the moment are sort of the heart of the debate, to the issues that she thought were important to mention as well. And if you were closely listening to the competitiveness agenda, I would say that was a because of China agenda, not a China agenda. And so this is, you know, sometimes you don't have to say China, you mean China. As I said, when you talk about taking control over technologies and energies that will fuel our economy, is what you're saying, that's just code for China, right? So it doesn't actually matter if you call it out so directly. What you did call out directly is, you know, the Chinese military parade, the meetings with Putin, the direct counterpoint that poses to Europe's security interest. What she did point out also is that that's where she sees where Europe needs to act more strongly in sort of pushing back against that as well. So I would say, I think in overall terms, the amount of China that was mentioned was adequate to where the discussion is at the moment. But also the entire competitiveness agenda in the end is tied up in a changing approach to China, to Chinese products in the European market, to tightening restrictions, to tightening and to supporting Europe's own industrial sectors. So I would say, on balance, it was probably about right. It was probably not the time in which she was going to make some big China-related announcements. That there was too much other ground to cover for that. So I wasn't expecting that either.
Agathe, having in mind the picture of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, you talked about the rules-based order and what it means for the global, the kind of economic cooperation. You said you were expecting more on G20, but were you surprised that there was little China in that speech, given that background?
Well, I think that I would agree with Janka. First, there were coded mentions of China, definitely. But I think that this is also about the approach that von der Leyen is trying to take, to have an inward look at Europe. You know, when we talk about competitiveness, when we talk about relations with economic partners, it's not only about reacting to what partners do, it's about Europe taking on measures that will benefit Europeans no matter whatever the others do. And I think that this has really been the approach of the EU, you know, focusing on deepening the single market, trying to cut in red tape, trying to implement all the policies of the Draghi report. When you think about it, the Draghi report is not about China, or the US. It's about taking this inward look and doing things that will benefit Europeans no matter what. And when we look at the speech, she didn't really talk about the US either, which is the big question at the moment, at least in the trade, the finance, the investment spheres. The mood is all about the US. I think that it's fair to say that a number of European policymakers would say that the US is the top challenge in their mind in the economic field at the moment. So I think that this was really about taking this inward look. And as Janka mentions, von der Leyen still mentioned a number of events that we've seen recently. I think that we've seen a lot about the Russia-China economic rapprochement at the latest summit. You know, we had announcements regarding the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, gas pipeline, being I don't want to say built because there are still many details to be honed, but at least there was progress in this field. So we had these announcements. We had a number of announcements of investments, more investments, bilateral investments between Russia and China. So I was a bit skeptical that the rapprochement between Russia and China was taking place in the trade field lately, but I think that in the investment field, we're definitely seeing some steps. And of course, this will have consequences on the global order, the rules-based order, everything that we know at the moment. And so the whole question is for Europe how to remain relevant in this new context. And of course, that's very difficult, but it's all about remaining a global economic power, because again, geopolitical power derives from economic might.
Thanks. I think this is a good question for our last round. How can we remain relevant as the EU? Draghi, in a recent speech, said we should redefine the EU basically towards a more federal kind of cooperation. At the same time, we do know our national debates, our domestic debates. They're nowhere near, giving more rights and more prerogatives to the EU institutions. So if you look at your own area, what do you think would be kind of the refounding moment for the EU? What would be in the next 12 months? What would be the big thing that would be kind of a make or break point for the EU in this extremely hostile environment where we don't simply have competitors, we have bitter rivals? I don't know, Tiago, maybe we can start with you.
Yes, so there's a lot to be done, but the things that we need to see happen, they also will require at some point in time, I believe, further political integration. We cannot simply spend more nationally in a fragmented fashion, each national army reinforcing itself. Actually, it would be counterproductive to do so on a strictly national and fragmented way. So the EU needs to provide more funding for member states to act. That's correct. That's what it's doing. But beyond that, if we are serious on defense, we will need down the road more political integration. And looking at European history, it would be probably not a good idea to spend more militarily based on simply on national armies and reinforcing those national armies. So we need to frame this movement that is now happening in terms of creating a Europe of defense. We need to frame it as a real European policy. And that will require some bold decisions that we will need to take to reinforce the European arm, the European pillar of defense as a true European policy. This is a very sensitive area because it's a sovereignty area, very linked to national powers. And so it will be very difficult to convince national governments to give up on their sovereign powers. But if we are serious about making Europe a geopolitical military power, we will need to take some bold steps and consider that possibility further down the road.
According to Eurobarometer, the latest one, more than 2/3 of Europeans expect this from the EU actually to defend them from security threats. But can you say what is kind of the most urgent thing? Because you said we need to take steps, but what is the most urgent thing on defense that the EU should try to move from the national level to the EU institutions?
I think the mindset has to be preparedness. So for now, we're talking about spending more spending better and spending European. So buying more equipment, buying it from the European defense industrial and technological base, and buying it collectively through joint purchases, etc. It makes sense. But beyond that, we need a sense of preparedness. And this requires what I was talking a while ago about this whole of society approach and whole of economy approach, in which everything is at stake, really. It's the access to raw material. If we are entering a serious war effort, hopefully not, but if we have to be prepared for that. And for that scenario, we need access to raw materials. We need supply chains to keep flowing. We need finance. We need to speed up administrative procedures and purchasing and procurement. We need to cover a lot of ground, really. We need civilian preparedness. We need civil protection mechanisms which are stronger. We need and all of this must be linked, so that if one area or one part of or one member state in our union is attacked, others can move in, and the EU has powers to direct even economic players to step in and produce more of what is in shortage, etc. So we need a global approach to the economy, really, to make sure that we are prepared for what might come. And this might be a military incident, but it might be a natural disaster. It might be some sort of blackout, as we've seen in the Iberian Peninsula a few months ago. For any kind of emergencies in a world which is much more insecure, we need to be prepared as a union as a whole. Ursula von der Leyen also talked about the union as a whole, and a whole which is more powerful and stronger whole. This is what we need also in terms of security, but in a broad sense of security, not just the military one, where we need to obviously to take steps, but overall we need to have this preparedness mentality in which we have to prepare every aspect of our policies, of our society, of our economy, to respond in case there is a threat that requires such a response.
Thank you. Janka, what is the one thing that you think one has to focus on in the next 12 months? And maybe if you want to also tackle Sophia's question on the US and how we should prepare ourselves for the future, even after Trump, if we survive Trump.
Sure. Maybe that's the main point, right? Europe has to be ready for a world in which blackmail is now a policy tool that is being used by our partners and our enemies alike. And I think for me, being less sort of prone to being blackmailed is the approach for the next 12 months. What can be done to make that potential in others' hands smaller? Very pragmatically. That is from stockpiling critical raw materials, entering into alliances, making sure that some of the mining can happen very close by, that you actually get the money over the finishing line so that you can have the product that you need, also on a shorter time scale. So I think that's like one of the main areas. And then it is protect the industries that you have. Don't let others go, because what Agathe is saying is obviously really right. Like, Europe is losing economic power, but to also remember that currently Europe's economy is still bigger than China's. Right? That's something that we need to remind ourselves of every once in a while. We still have a larger GDP. You know, that's important that we have to think about this, because that actually does change something about the psychology of all of these dynamics that are ongoing at the moment. So I think we have to be really clear that if we want to push back against some of these areas, we have to make sure that in wind technology, we maintain a leadership. On batteries and on electric vehicles, we are competitive. That on grid technologies, we have greater independence. From solar inverters to what we are looking at for in terms of sort of the future of the integration of next generation solar panels. So all of this has to be part of our European architecture. And the next 12 months will not be make or break moments for that, but the decisions of the next 12 months will either make it easier or harder to get to that point. And I think that's sort of talking about the next 12 months and make or break points is maybe not quite right for this kind of area, but it is an area in which we are talking about sort of putting the course of action on the right tracks to then actually be able to deliver on this. But if we wait another 12 months, we're certainly not going to be in a better position.
Things develop so quickly that I even think that 12 months are too long of a time. Agathe.
Well, we will survive Trump. We will definitely survive him. And I think that the point here is, maybe it's because I'm a surfer, you can't stop the wave, but you can try to ride it. And so the question to me is today, how can we make Trump an opportunity to pass reforms that were previously unthinkable because they were politically controversial, because they seem overly ambitious? I mean, how can we do something to turn the storm into an opportunity? So I hear you want very concrete stuff, Vessela, so I will try to be super concrete. I would say in the next 12 months, I would be very, very pleased to see 3 things happening. The first one, and I may be the only French person saying this, the conclusion of the EU-Mercosur free trade agreement, which I think is absolutely critical. And I think that it would send a very powerful symbol beyond the economic benefits of the deal. It would send a very powerful signal, well, to the rest of the world, that the EU is serious about developing ties with new partners. Because we shouldn't make any mistake here. If we don't sign the deal with the Mercosur countries, they will turn to China. China is already their largest trading partner. So I think this is the first one to me. Then the second one, and this is something that Tiago alluded to, it's about Eurobonds. So I don't think that we'll have EU-wide debt in the coming 12 months. I don't think so, but I think that there are proposals to, for instance, convert a portion of existing EU sovereign debt from EU member states into senior Eurobonds. I think that such a step, of course, it's incremental, but it would pave the way for more integration, for debt. And this is going to be critical because as the EU is facing 3 shocks, higher defense spending, an aging population, and climate change, adaptation to climate change, we will need money to adapt to these challenges. So joint debt. And then finally, it's all about competitiveness. I don't really like this word. I would say productivity growth. So we need to be able to channel more money to EU tech startups. And this will require regulatory reforms to help venture capital funds invest in EU tech startups. I have very concrete proposals in the policy brief I'll publish next week, so I won't say more. I won't do any spoilers, but I think that we also need to focus on this because demographics and productivity growth are the 2 determinants of long-term economic growth. We can't do much on the demographics front, but we can try to boost productivity growth, and that's our only chance to remain relevant. I think this was the key word for this webinar, relevance.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Agathe, Janka, and Tiago. We covered quite a lot of ground. I still am sorry that we could not answer the question on global health resilience, but I hope you appreciate that our experts have still been capable of basically walking us not only through von der Leyen's speech, but also through the next 12 months. Thank you very much for that, and all the best to all of our participants. See you next time. Bye.